Part 3, Rethinking the Modular Nation Form. Chatterjee would thus seek to repudiate Anderson's argument about the modularity of the nation form. Manu Goswami attempts a reformulation and adaptation of the notion of modularity in her important 2002 article, Rethinking the Modular Nation Form, towards a socio-historical conception of nationalism. In the article, Goswami sets out to critically reconstruct Benedict Anderson's concept of nationalism through the optic of recent calls to mediate the canonical opposition between objectivity and subjectivity. She claims that a central task for scholars of nationalism is to fashion a framework that integrates and treats as methodologically inseparable the objective and subjective dimensions of nationalism as a modern social form. To this end, she notes that historians Jeff Ely and Ronald Suney identify Anderson's imagined communities as inaugurating a fundamental methodological reorientation from structural and materialist to cultural studies perspectives on nationalism. She further points out that, though from an interdisciplinary perspective, his work marks the genealogical locus of contemporary subjectivist approaches to nationalism, these works nevertheless have largely ignored or consciously repudiated his argument about the modular character of nationalism. Goswami holds Anderson's theory in high regard. More specifically, she maintains that whatever its deficiencies, Anderson's theory of nationalism sought to elucidate the historically novel discursive structure of national imaginings and embed them within broader historical transformations. It attempted to theorize in tandem shifts in technological institutions, cultural categories, and categorical identities. More particularly, she continues, his account of the modular character of late 19th and early 20th century nationalism directed attention to the trans-regional circulation and transplantation of nationalist discourses, symbols, and strategies. And in so doing, she contends, it underlined the importance of the global and comparative historical aspects of nationalism. Goswami further suggests that the concept of modular nationalism is central to the attempt to combine the insights of objective and subjective approaches. Thus, her attempt to rework Anderson's notion of modularity to address what she sees as the inadequacies of his formulation. According to Goswami, these inadequacies include an insufficient specification of the historical specificity and constitution of the modular character of nationalism. Goswami argues that Anderson's attempt to close the gap between objectivist and subjectivist approaches is undermined by a central tension between what she calls socio-historical versus ideal-typical conceptions of modular nationalism. For Goswami, Anderson goes wrong by conceptualizing modularity as a universal process of mimesis, of self-identical repetition through time and across space, rather than historically constituted systemic dimension of the modern nation form. This allegedly leads Anderson to privilege the subjectivist dimension of nationalism and to fail to pay sufficient attention to dynamic and eventful reconfigurations of nationalism. What exactly does Goswami mean by criticizing Anderson for erring on the side of the subjectivist dimension? What is wrong with an excessively subjectivist approach? Goswami is willing to acknowledge that many recent subjectivist approaches to nationalism have sharpened our understanding of the internal tensions within nationalist discourse, especially the fraught management of race, gender, and class differences, the dispersed disciplinary regimes that shape nationalist practices, and the interpolation of individuals and collectivities into normative national subjects. Nevertheless, despite these virtues, she criticizes such works for having paid less attention to the ways in which broader social processes and institutions, such as the dynamics of modern interstate system, and the universalizing logic of capital, the institutionalized tie between nationhood and statehood, shape the socio-political and discursive structure of nationalism. Goswami contends that though Anderson does not explicitly elaborate his theory of modular nationalism with reference to the problematic of mediating between objective and subjective dimensions, his framework nevertheless contains sustained moments of a challenge both to objectivism and to subjectivism. Goswami summarizes Anderson's account as positing a constitutive nexus between the print capitalist reconstitution of language, the novel apprehension of temporality and gendered, and the discursive matrix of national imaginings. She points out that, according to Anderson, the modular character of nationalism emerged only in the mid to late 19th century, after the accumulated print memory of the French Revolution and nationalist movements in the Americas assumed by the mid-19th century the status of a globally available concept, model, and indeed blueprint. Goswami contends that Anderson's narrative about the modular nature of nationalism contains a strong, if implicit, assumption of path dependency. That is, the notion that temporally prior nationalist movements significantly shape the dynamic and trajectory of later nationalist movements. As she thus puts it, for Anderson, modular refers to path-dependent and translocal transplantation of particular nationalist models through time and across. Goswami relays that, and across space. Goswami relays that Anderson's concept of modular nationalism has been criticized from two closely related perspectives. On the one hand, some scholars have claimed that the conception of modular nationalism privileges the role of large-scale structural shifts at the expense of a concrete analysis of which social groups were most invested in discourses of nationhood. On the other, various other theorists, including Chatterjee, have argued that the idea of modular nationalism erases the specificity of nationalist movements, especially anti-colonial nationalism, and sets up a hierarchical distinction between origin and copy. Both versions of this critique, Goswami contends, take issue with the homogenizing implications of Anderson's analysis. At the same time, she insists, both versions of this critique presuppose and rhetorically overstate the particularity of nationalist imaginings. Whereas these critics would seek to abolish the notion of modularity, Goswami argues in favor of a substantive reformulation of the concept instead. Goswami accuses Anderson of espousing an ideal typical conceptualization of modularity, one that spreads through mimesis and transplantation. Such notions, she insists, suggest, in the manner of diffusion models dear to modernization theorists, reiteration without change, and establish a problematic hierarchy between copy, origin, and copy. Perhaps even more importantly, Goswami contends, insofar as ideal typical conceptions assume a universal and transhistorical process of mimesis, they are unable to pose, let alone address questions such as, what accounts for the historical clustering of nationalist movements at particular socio-historical conjunctures, such as 1848, the 1870s, 1914 to 1915, the 1960s, and 1989 to 91? According to Goswami, these questions cannot be addressed through abstract theoretical frameworks without doing violence to the realities of multiple causalities, contingent conjunctures, and eventful transformations that inform social and political life. She further argues, in a vein ironically somewhat reminiscent to that of Baba, that the static assumptions intrinsic to an understanding of modularity as mimesis are especially apparent in Anderson's selective appropriation of Walter Benjamin's account of capitalist historicity as homogeneous empty time. Goswami emphasizes that Benjamin's quarrel with the conception of a homogeneous empty time led him to refashion the motif of imitation as remembering a suppressed past. Acts of collective critical remembering contain the potential of breaking the perceived homogeneous empty flow of progress, of seizing the possibilities of the present, and mediating between the past and the present, the actual and the possible. Along Benjaminian lines, what Goswami calls a socio-historical conception of modularity would emphasize the possibility of reconstitution based upon a historically constituted range of possibilities and the contradictory spatio-temporal dynamic of capitalism. Goswami thus attempts a reformulation of the concept of modularity in a way that retains Anderson's insight about the path-dependent character of nationalism, but abandoned its teleological and static assumptions. Rather than modularity understood as transplantation, Goswami advocates a conception of modularity understood as transposition. She explains, inherent to the transposition, as opposed to the transplantation of social forms, is the agentic and dynamic reconfiguration of cultural categories, institutional repertoires, and meanings. The conception of modularity as transposability implies a process of ongoing, path-dependent, and eventful transformations rather than the static replication of received social and cultural forms. Goswami goes on to argue that modularity was the discursive counterpart to the changes initiated by the deepening, widening, and intensification of multi-scalar and multi-temporal processes of global capitalist and colonial restructuring. According to Goswami, the structuration of the nation form as modular during this period was made possible by a range of interlocking processes. These include A, the increasing superimposition and interpenetration of socioeconomic cultural relations, and the competitive rescaling of social relations along national territorial lines. B, the formation of states as spatio-temporal frameworks of power in conjunction with the emergence of a dynamic, relational, and structured field of interstate relations. C, the discursive co-constitution and the growing intertextuality of nationalist discourse in a range of regional contexts. And D, the nationalization and naturalization of social and cultural categories of practice and understanding. Goswami's account of modularity hones in on the decades between the late 1870s and 1914, which marked, for instance, the unprecedented dissemination of nationalist movements in both colonized and imperial national contexts in Europe, South Asia, and East Asia. According to Goswami, these nationalist movements were distinguished by widely shared particularistic and organic conceptions of nationhood, evinced in the novel emphasis placed on common territory, language, ethnicity, and race as the essential markers of nationhood. Moreover, she continues, late 19th and early 20th century nationalisms discursively converged around an invocation of an already existent, internally homogeneous, and externally distinctive nation. Widely shared historicist claims that sovereign statehood was the culmination of an inner dialectic and a profoundly statist orientation that reflected the progressive institutionalization of the link between nationhood and statehood. Finally, she adds, during the early 20th century, what she calls the intertextuality of nationalist discourse sharpened with the generalization of the doctrine of self-determination in its Wilsonian and Leninist articulations. Goswami draws two methodological conclusions from her socio-historic reworking of the concept of the modular nation. These are, first, that the origins, character, and trajectory of particular nationalist movements cannot be understood apart from the simultaneous focus on their articulation with a historically specific relational and dynamic global field. Moreover, second, she insists, the notion of a dynamic and relational field implies both objective and subjective relations of interdependence and formal equivalence. Goswami's reworked notion of modularity allows her to make a prediction of sorts, namely, it suggests the limits of perspectives that view the future of the nation state and nationalism as one of either imminent dissolution or mechanical reproduction. In a word, the nation form is, for now, here to stay, though it is also bound to evolve in perhaps unforeseeable ways. No longer in a future heaven. In the concluding chapter, No Longer in a Future Heaven, Nationalism, Gender, and Race, from her 1995 book, Imperial Leather, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Colonial Contest, Anne McClintock takes Benedict Anderson to task as well as most of his critics to task for ignoring the way in which the nation is always gendered. She begins the chapter by recalling Anderson's warning against Gellner's dictum that nationalism invents nations, that Gellner tends to associate invention with falsity rather than with imagining and creation. She rehearses Anderson's view that nations, in his all too famous phrase, are imagined communities in the sense that they are systems of cultural representation whereby people come to imagine a shared experience of identification with an extended community. From this, she proceeds to emphasize that, as such, nations are not simply phantasmagoria of the mind, but are historical practices through which social difference is both invented and performed. But then, crucially, she adds, nationalism becomes, as a result, radically constitutive of people's identities through social contexts that are frequently violent and always gendered. Yet, she concludes, if the invented nature of nationalism has found wide theoretical currency, explorations of the gendering of the national imaginary have been conspicuously paltry. McClintock emphasizes that all nations depend on powerful constructions of gender. In her words, despite many nationalists' ideological investment in the idea of popular unity, nations have historically amounted to the sanctioned institutionalization of gender difference. And yet, she argues, with the notable exception of Frantz Fanon, male theorists have seldom felt moved to explore how nationalism is implicated in gender power. McClintock quotes the path-breaking work of Nira Yuval Davis and Floya Anthias, who identify 5 major ways in which women have been implicated in nationalism. 1, as biological reproducers of the members of national collectivities. 2, as reproducers of the boundaries of national groups through restrictions on sexual or marital relations. 3, as active transmitters and producers of the national culture. 4, as symbolic signifiers of national difference. And 5, as active participants in national struggles. She goes on to sketch the contours of what she thinks the elaboration of a feminist theory of nationalism would entail. According to McClintock, such a theory should be strategically fourfold. 1, investigating the gendered formation of sanctioned male theories. 2, bringing into historical visibility women's active cultural and political participation in national formations. 3, bringing nationalist institutions into critical relation with other social structures and institutions. and 4, at the same time, paying scrupulous attention to the structures of racial, ethnic, and class power that continue to bedevil privileged forms of feminism. In the rest of the chapter, McClintock tries to live up to this fourfold scholarly agenda by paying extended attention to the writings of Frantz Fanon in particular, before engaging in a critical feminist analysis of the racialized, class, and gender trajectories of the nationalisms of the Afrikaner community and the African National Congress in the South African context. Let us here, however, focus on the attention she pays to Benedict Anderson in the course of her account. In a preliminary section on the gendering of nation time, McClintock quotes Baba, who, following Anderson, writes, "Nations like narratives lose their origins in the myths of time and only fully realize their horizons in the mind's eye." She goes on to emphasize that Baba and Anderson borrow here from Walter Benjamin's crucial insight into the temporal paradox of modernity. She adds, for Benjamin, a central feature of 19th century industrial capitalism was the use of archaic images to identify what was historically new about the nature of commodities. In Benjamin's insight, the mapping of progress depends on systematically inventing images of archaic time to identify what is historically new about enlightened national progress. Anderson can thus ask, supposing antiquity were at a certain historical conjuncture the necessary consequence of novelty? From this point, she goes on to argue, what is less often noticed, however, is that the temporal anomaly within nationalism, veering between nostalgia for the past and the impatient progressive sloughing off of the past, is typically resolved by figuring the contradiction in the representation of time as a natural division of gender. She therefore contends women are represented as the atavistic and authentic body of national tradition, inert, backward-looking, and natural, embodying nationalism's conservative principle of continuity. Men, by contrast, represent the progressive agent of national modernity, forward-thrusting, potent, and historic, embodying nationalism's progressive or revolutionary principle of discontinuity. Nationalism's anomalous relation to time is thus managed as a natural relation to gender. McClintock concludes, national time is thus not only secularized, it is also domesticated. Social evolutionism and anthropology, she insists, gave to national politics a concept of natural time as familial. In the image of the family tree, evolutionary progress was represented as a series of anatomically distinct family types organized into a linear procession from the childhood of primitive races to the enlightened adulthood of European imperial nationalism. In the chapter, McClintock also takes aim at Anderson's emphasis on print capitalism, arguing instead that nationalism relies more on what she calls mass national commodity spectacle. In the course of her account of the trajectory of Afrikaner nationalism, with a focus on the episode of the so-called Second Trek, she comments, in our time, national collectivity is experienced preeminently through spectacle. Here I depart from Anderson, who sees nationalism as emerging primarily from the Gutenberg technology of print capitalism. Anderson, she contends, neglects the fact that print capital has, until recently, been accessible to a relatively small literate elite. Indeed, she suggests, the singular power of nationalism since the late 19th century has been its capacity to organize a sense of popular, collective unity through the management of mass national commodity spectacle. In this respect, she goes on to argue, nationalism inhabits the realm of fetishism. Despite the commitment of European nationalism to the idea of the nation state as the embodiment of rational progress, nationalism has been experienced and transmitted primarily through fetishism, precisely the cultural form that the Enlightenment denigrated as the antithesis of reason. More often than not, she insists, nationalism takes shape through the visible, ritual organization of fetish objects, flags, uniforms, airplane logos, maps, anthems, national flowers, national cuisines, and architectures, as well as through the organization of collective fetish spectacle in team sports, military displays, mass rallies, the myriad forms of popular culture, and so on. Far from being purely phallic icons, she emphasizes, fetishes embody crises in social value, which are projected onto and embodied in what can be called impassioned objects. Yet she concludes, considerable work remains to be done to consume, refuse, or negotiate the male fetish rituals of national spectacle. Conclusion. Let us therefore conclude. In this lecture, we have brought into focus the topic of nations, nation states, and post-colonialism through an extended engagement with the work of Benedict Anderson and his critics, including Homi Bhabha, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Partha Chatterjee, Manu Goswami, and Anne McClintock. In the process, we interrogated the nature of Anderson's claim that the nation is best conceived as an imagined community. We also explored in some depth Anderson's argument about the rise of the new conception of temporality, what he calls, following Walter Benjamin, homogeneous empty time, as a condition of possibility for the emergence of national consciousness. We further investigated Anderson's claim about the role of processes of print capitalism in the diffusion and mediation of national consciousness, as well as his argument about the modularity of the nation form. We ended with the discussion of the absence of a gender analytic in Anderson's account. With that, we shall finish.